Hey, it's Mazzy. Welcome back to the channel. Kind of doing a bit of a Beatles versus Stones video, but this is very specific, very focused, laser beam focused. I don't want to battle these two bands that are both friggin' great bands, but I want to talk about these two albums because the last few days I've been playing this like about 3 or 4 times because I sold one in an auction, so I wanted to listen to it to make sure it sounded good. And this is a copy that I got. This is a stereo copy. This is the British edition. The British edition on both these albums is very different than the American edition. I'll get into that. And this is a Decca version, and I really should look it up in Discogs, and I haven't because I'm just at my R's Discogging. But this is like a white label. It's not a promo. But this album sounds incredible. It's stereo, and it's wonderful for a Stones record, from a 60s Stones record. You may or may not know that obviously the London records that we bought in stereo in the States were all rechanneled for stereo. The monos are the better ones to get. I think same with the Decca things, but this is the first album they actually recorded most of it. Most of it is true stereo, recorded at RCA Studios in Los Angeles between their international touring. And this is the first time they wrote all the songs, Jagger and Richard. This is a mature album. And this album is a direct influence from what the Beatles did here in December of 1965 with Rubber Soul. An amazing record. Obviously, this wonderful photograph by Robert Freeman, who did a handful of Beatle records, their early albums up through this album, actually. And just a great photographer. And this was one of the very first albums ever without the name of the artist on the cover. They were so recognizable. Well, of course, who follows suit? This is photographed by the British photographer Guy Webster. Any similarity is coincidental here. But like the Beatles, the Stones brought in other instrumental flourishes, and especially Brian Jones, who added to it. Brian Jones didn't write any of the songs per se, but he's a very big part of the sound of this record. These bands realized that they could put other things in, not just the straight 4-piece and maybe a piano or a keyboard or something. There's a lot of different things adding to the specialty of these records. And listen to this record again, hearing it in stereo, and I have heard it before, but for some reason, it just sounded so much better. Now, my new Spender speakers probably had something to do with that, but it opened up me to loving this record even more than I did, even though it's my favorite of this period of Rolling Stones record in 1966. I first got this mono copy of the American edition in December of 1965. I might have gotten it for Hanukkah or Christmas, a crossover. My father was a convert, so Russian Orthodox, so we celebrated both because of my grandparents. I also, in 1966, got the American version here. This is a David Bailey, another great British photographer, but this is the American edition, and this is a mono edition. I got it in mono, which is probably the good thing. I didn't understand what electronically processed for stereo, and a lot of the Stones album I have of this period are electronically processed. I don't think their sound as bad as some people say they do. I mean, you really have to kind of get your mindset of enjoying the music first, and whatever it sounds like, especially the stereo rigs I had back in when I was 12 and 13 years old. But this, Aftermath. Now, the original title of this, or the working title, was something about walking on the water. And of course, American London freaked out. This is around the time of the John Lennon is bigger than Jesus comment. So it's a good thing they didn't do that, probably, because they would have got flack from the Bible Belt and a lot of radio stations in the South during that time. We know what John and the Beatles went through there. But these, again, were produced by Andrew Loog Oldham. Again, this was recorded in Los Angeles. And there are a little bit of other few musicians added, and especially Jack Nietzsche, who kind of grounded them in piano. Now, the biggest difference between these two, the obvious difference are the number of tracks. Usually you had an average of about 12 tracks on an American record because the publishing was paid per song, unlike in the UK. So in the UK, obviously you'd get 14 songs on average. It would change slightly depending on the length of the song. Also, the UK was the longest record on vinyl at the time. It's post plus 50 minutes. It's 52, 53 minutes, which is long. But I tell you, this Decca stereo sounds excellent. All that thing about, a long record should be split over 2 LPs and something. Well, it didn't happen here. They've never done that. And this is a great, great, great record. And of course, in the UK, especially with the Beatles, singles wouldn't be added. In fact, at the time they were recording this, 2 of their best singles, A and B sides or double A sides, how you want to look at it, Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out, were recorded during these sessions. This is recorded in something like 13 days, over a month, at Abbey Road Studios. And this is a mature album. This is the first time, really, we felt an album was a consistent entity. Of course, Help. And also, this is only the second album where every track was written by the Beatles after A Hard Day's Night. British versions, I'm saying. But there are a lot of different flourishes on here. George Harrison plays the sitar. The harmonium is added here. Paul plays that really wonderful fuzz bass on this record, on Think for Yourself. And it's just a killer. It adds something. And on both these albums, there's that extra instrumental thing that just adds something. Going back to this album, Under My Thumb. Now, we can talk about the misogyny all over this album. It's a time, a place. I'm not defending it, but there's great friggin' songs. Stupid Girl, Mother's Little Helper, and Under My Thumb. Not the really greatest way to treat women or write about women, but Under My Thumb, what makes that song? Not the lyrics specifically, but that marimba that Brian Jones pulled out that was at the studio, that he did that part. That's an essential part of that song, and that makes that song perfect. He doesn't even get a songwriting credit for that great part of that. He plays some dulcimer on here. He plays different instruments. Again, he's the one that adds those special sounds on here that make it just tasty as hell. They heard Rubber Soul, and they went in, not to duplicate Rubber Soul. They're not a pop band in the same way the Beatles were, or are, was. They just created some great songwriting, too. There's Baroque stuff on here with that wonderful arrangement with the Lady Jane. What a great song that is. I Am Waiting, another beautiful, more on the pop side of the Rolling Stones, which shows the maturity of this songwriting. Now, going back to the Beatles, obviously, on Rubber Soul, the thing that really stands out here are the vocal blends of the 3 of them, the 2 of them, even John overdubbing and double tracking his own voice, doing his own harmonies. The perfect blend on here, even on a George Harrison song, like Think for Yourself, the harmonies over the chorus in the background are just brilliant. What makes it so different than the UK also is that acoustic feel, that folk rock feel to this album. Capitol took a couple tracks off the British Help. Remember, in the America, Help was a soundtrack with incidental music and score music. This was strictly a Beatle record with songs from the film plus a bunch of other songs recorded and added to this. But Capitol took several songs off it, including I've Just Seen a Face, which leads it off, that gives you the feel of acoustic, folky rock record on here. And also, I'm Looking Through You. Those songs alone add to this blend that's very influenced. Remember, the Beatles in 1965, when they're in America, the American tour, they meet Bob Dylan, they're hanging out with the Byrds, and there's a very kind of feel and influence, a rotating influence of Bob Dylan, folk music, the Byrds, that whole feeling. And all these bands were trading ideas, not specifically, but as a result of the records they would all be putting out at the time in 65 and 66. And this album looks like a cover of what would be a cowboy country album, just that suede coat shirt that John Lennon's wearing on there. Now, I have about 10 copies of Rubber Soul in different configurations, different tonalities of the color of the logo on here. And not only was this so different, I got the American one, and then I didn't get the British copies for about a year to a year and a half of both Aftermath and Rubber Soul. A year after I heard the Americans, I finally heard the UK copies. Back then, a year and a half seemed like forever when you're 12, 13 years old. It just, time goes by so slow. The difference now. Also, a few months after I got the mono version, I got the stereo American version. And again, something blew my mind. In those days, you didn't think of different changes and mixes and sounds. At least consciously, I didn't. But when I put on I'm Looking Through You on the stereo, there's a false intro, that opening guitar riff that Paul plays. That dun 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 dun. He stops and starts again. There's like a double false intro. When I heard that, it blew my mind, and I kept playing it over and over again. It's only on the stereo, the American stereo version. As far as I know, it's not on any other version. It's certainly not on the British stereo version. The singles were part of all these records, were in the UK. Everything was separate there. But Rubber Soul, again, in December 1965, game changer. We started thinking of albums as complete artworks, pieces of music. But again, 3 weeks, 4 weeks recording this, not even that, 13 days in the studio to do all this. Amazing. Now, the Stones, on the other hand, of course, back in the USA, they're editing things out. I think this is kind of a terrible cover, and I am a fan of David Bailey, that British photographer. I just think the design is bad. So there is some similarity with this Guy Webster shot opposed to the Robert Freeman shot here. And again, as I said, a big part of these records is the instrumentation. On the Stones album, you not only have the proper Stones, you have marimbas, bells by Brian Jones. You have dulcimer and sitar from Brian Jones. You have piano, organ, harpsichord of Jack Nitzsche, and you have harpsichord and a piano by Ian Stewart. Lighting by Mick Jagger. This came out, I think it was in May in the UK, and then June in the United States, June of 1966. So this was a massive record for the Stones in America and in the UK. But the American was a very different track list. It opens up with Painted Black. That was a single that's not on the British version, and it moves things around. Now, as perfect as this album is, they do hark back to some of the blues. Before this, they were strictly almost a blues band. Obviously, you throw in Satisfaction and some great singles and some great songs when they started writing songs themselves. But they were basically a blues band. This changes all that. Now, you got a good thing. You got this 11 and a half minute Going Home that's kind of an on and on, just kind of a jam. And Mick Jagger singing Going Home, 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 all along. And it's a kind of a fun little piece, maybe a waste of 11 and a half minutes. But then they get into, It's Not Easy. That's pretty much of a standard blues thing. That could be like Little Red Rooster or something. But everything else, What to Do even, that closes up, is a brilliant song. Opening up with Mother's Little Helper really sets the tone. And, you know, I can't remember back when I was 12 years old listening to that, understanding what uppers were and, you know, housewives taking pills and doing drugs, just to kind of stay relevant to life, I guess. That's at least where Mick Jagger, think about Mick Jagger in his, early 20s, writing about these stories there and writing about the way he writes about women at this point. As I said earlier, with Stupid Girl and Under My Thumb. But you got a great record and a mature record for a band that just was doing strictly blues stuff for the 2 years prior to this. So when it comes to Aftermath, my point of view, you need this one. You don't really need this one unless you're a Stones completist. I am, actually, for the most part. This is the one that supersedes this. You can get those other tracks like Painted Black on some comps. In terms of the Beatles, I think you need them both because of the sequencing of it. And it's the one time, accidentally or not, that Capitol Records made it a better release, made their version better. Again, it's subjective, but I think this is the more consistent feel and listen, even though the Beatles did this great album. And I couldn't live without either at this point. But obviously, since I first heard this as 11-and-a-half-year-old, this comes slightly second. But again, all the songs are great. Now, to confuse things even more, Capitol kind of shook things up in 1966, putting out this. They wanted more product. It was product, product, product. So they put out originally like this, that was not really released, and then this, which is a comp. Bringing all these singles together. You do have on here We Can Work It Out and Day Tripper from those Rubber Soul sessions. They were left over. They were singles, obviously, in the UK. But of course, Capitol does this. They take 4 songs ahead of time from Revolver. The John Lennon songs, some of the greatest songs on Revolver, are ripped from what would come out on Revolver. And of course, there are different mixes. You have I'm Only Sleeping. You have Nowhere Man. You have Ain't a Bird Can Sing. Strips away these great John Lennon songs. So when we got Revolver in America, it was very different. And this is where I totally agree that the original British version is the greatest album. And I will say, not to kick the Rolling Stones down, but this comes out, in June 1966 in America, and by the end of that summer, this just fucking blows it away. I mean, this is the pinnacle of Beatle records as far as I'm concerned. Even with Yellow Submarine, to me, this is my #1 Beatle album. The artwork, the maturity, again, the psychedelia. Now, Rubber Soul, the Beatles' Rubber Soul, some consider, I think John Lennon called it their pot album. This was heavy influenced by marijuana, some LSD, except for McCartney yet. He kind of held off. Obviously, Dylan turned them onto pot. So this is a drug album. In closing, I'm just going to say these are 2 important critical albums in the careers of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. There is this running theme from some of the Beatle fans that whatever the Beatles did, the Stones followed 6 months later. Sgt. Pepper, Satanic Majesty's Request. You could argue that for a while. And then, of course, in 1970, when the Beatles split up, the Rolling Stones became the greatest rock and roll band by default. And you could honestly say the Beatles were more of a pop band. The Rolling Stones rarely had those great harmony vocals. I mean, it was a Jagger-Richard thing. It was a Mick Jagger in front. And yes, Keith would throw in a track here, and the others would do harmonizing to a point. But the Beatles had a vocal thing. Again, it's not better, it's just different. And obviously, I prefer that beautiful harmonic sound, or even when they rocked, and maybe they didn't do blues like the Stones. The Stones were very influenced by that bluesy thing, where the Beatles were influenced more of the Motown and the Stax. And the whole joke, if you will, to this title, Rubber Soul, is because there's some like soul influence on this, as I said, from Stax and Motown and the American group, especially when they were traveling through the States in the summer of 1965. Think of all those great songs that were on the radio. The Beatles were listening to those songs, and you have some of that in here. And the joke about Rubber Soul is like, they're not the real soul. The Rubber Soul are sort of a knockoff, not to say a cheaper version, but they're white guys doing a little bit of their version of soul music. We didn't even call it really Blue-Eyed Soul, did we? Righteous Brothers, maybe? That would be the Blue-Eyed Soul group of the day. But that is the joke here, at least the inside joke that I didn't know for many years. But 2 amazing records, nonetheless. And it's kind of fun doing this back and forth comparison because they're very different, but there was a circular influence. I mean, you can't deny the Beatles were influenced by the Stones, especially in the late 60s as well. But they seem to always do something a little more initially. They seem to push themselves. And unfortunately, the loss of Brian Jones, I think he really wanted to push them into different directions. And it sounds like Mick and Keith weren't having it as much. So that's just my point of view, my take on 2 wonderful records. Aftermath, the Rolling Stones, 1966. December 1965, the Beatles, Rubber Soul. Any version is a great version. Thanks for watching. Mazzy loves you.